Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this is going to be a good one, let me tell you. Do hope you enjoyed our intro music. That's episode 2 with this music. I'm still a fan. All right, so tonight's episode, we got a couple housekeeping items before I introduce tonight's guests. One thing I want to remind everybody that, of course, by joining us tonight, you do qualify for CEU credits if that's something that you collect, but there is a limited time in which you can collect your CEU credits. So make sure you head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning so you can plug in your info and let us know that you did watch. Also, if you scroll down a little bit, there is an e-newsletter you can sign up for. It will send you a reminder about the show and keep you in the loop and remind you to get those CEU credits. So if you're into that, please do. So quick reminder, just remember there is a limited time, so please make sure that you head on over and do that. The other thing, of course, we do have show sponsors. So the Agronomist is brought to you by Adama Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry, Adama is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your Adama sales rep today. And of course, Real Ag Radio, Monday to Friday on Sirius XM channel 147 at 4:30 Eastern. And Mind Your Farm Business goes usually twice a month. It's a podcast. You can get that at realagriculture.com or wherever you get your podcasts. All right. Without further ado, I bring not just our topic, but our guest tonight. I don't know which one I'm more excited about, but we are going to talk about tank additions. We're going to talk about surfactants and all sorts of lovely things that we can do to help make that spray pass just the best it can be. And so joining me from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan is Mr. Tom Wolf with Agrimetrix and Sprayers 101, and Mr. Greg Dahl, who's joining us from Fargo, North Dakota. Tonight, and he's Senior Research Manager with Winfield United. Welcome here, Tom. Welcome here, Greg.
Thanks for
Thanks for
having
having
us.
us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Okay. So, of course, big shout out to everybody who is here in the comments as well. In the comment section, make sure you get your questions in early and often. We've got a whole bunch of really great things to talk about tonight. I've got a lineup of questions as well, but always we love to hear from our guests as well. All right. Okay. So let's dive in. I do have a couple clips tonight. I only chose two as I don't usually get to them. But they are pretty important. But let's sort of frame this. Tom, maybe I'll start with you. We're talking about, getting the most out of that spray pass. We do have a clip of you a little later in the show talking about why, but especially this year, why do you think we're going to have to pay some extra attention to that spray pass?
There's a couple of reasons. I mean, one of them is the fact that we are expecting shortages of pesticides. So every little bit that we have is going to have to work well. And secondly, we've just come out of a drought and our water aquifers, they're low, surface waters are low, and their water quality has probably changed because of that. So we'll have to maximize that awareness also and maybe condition the water.
Okay. Now, and Greg, I mean, obviously not in the West, but what were growing conditions like in your neck of the woods? You're not all that far. Was it also dry where you do a lot of your research?
Oh yes, it was dry all the way to Texas. So basically, you take the Rocky Mountains all the way down and kind of the middle of the country. We experienced the drought as well, and then there were some areas where they had moisture and whatnot. But basically, we had tough conditions, just like you guys do in the West. So.
Now, I'm sitting here in Ottawa tonight. We got 40 centimeters of snow today, but we didn't have a lot until now. And so I know snow doesn't quite equate to rainfall, but moisture is moisture, and now there has been some moisture across the prairies. Tom, what's it looking like out in Saskatoon?
We've had snow as well. I think about a foot is on the ground at the moment. But I remember back in the day when we used to pay attention to the forecast that the wheat board used to give, and one of the things that they always said was they don't count snow cover because snow cover usually melts when the ground is frozen and runs off. So, we shouldn't overweight, but I mean every little bit helps. That's for sure.
Hmm. Absolutely. Okay. So one of the things I want to tackle tonight, for sure, is I do want to talk. We are going to talk about some specific products, but one of I think the big topics that we are going to tackle is that water quality and that water composition. So hard water, soft water, and those sorts of things. But what I definitely want to talk about is some of the differences between what we see south of the border and what we see here in Canada. So Jay, if you can queue up, and this is how Lara, who is already encouraging me that 2 clips is a good goal. We're going to go to 1 clip pretty early on because this kind of sets up a big part of the discussion. So Jay, if we can go to this first clip, we're going to look back now. This is from 2017. So let's listen and let's see when we come back after this clip what maybe has changed or not changed in the time since this.
We're here at Farm Forum event, and I'm with Rich Zollinger, and you were talking a lot about surfactants. So maybe let's just start with the basics. What is a surfactant?
Surfactant, or let's go the more broad name of adjuvant,
Yes.
would be anything you would add to a herbicide or a pesticide mixture to improve effectiveness.
And how does it do that?
3 ways. When that droplet comes out of the nozzle, you have to retain, there's number 1, the droplet on the leaf surface. Number 2 is you have to deposit the active ingredient in the plant or on the cuticle. And number 3, if you've done everything right, you get absorption of that active ingredient into the plant. Retention, deposition, and absorption.
So it can be one or all of those things that the adjuvant works
Yes,
through.
yes, one or all of them.
Okay, are all adjuvants equal in how they react with herbicides and help herbicides into the plant?
That is a motto that we use in the States, that not all adjuvants are created equal. And to know which ones are better or which ones are not as good is hard, because unless somebody that has done unbiased testing actually does the research, it's hard to know. Now, the farmer can actually become the scientist. They can take a product and use it on one field, and take another product and use it on one load, and then another product on another load, and then they can observe 28 days later which one works better. And so if there's no research data to be found, then the farmer actually becomes, in a way, the scientist.
And surfactants are regulated here now, like what we use with what herbicides?
Well, regulated would be an okay term, but I understand it that for a company to actually legitimately sell a product in Canada, they have to go through a registration process with your PMRA. They have to prove that it's safe to the crop, they have to prove that it's effective, and that it has no adverse reaction to people.
Is this different than what you see in the States?
Yeah, in the States, there is no
It's a free-for-all.
free-for-all. You and I, we could produce our own adjuvant, make $1 million and retire.
Oh, brilliant.
So get your ivory and palm olive, I don't know what you use for your dishes. That's all you have to do.
Mix something up.
Mix something up, yeah.
So what are the benefits of our way of doing it are obvious. What are some of the sort of consequences of that route?
So the chemical companies, they have simplified things in Canada. When you, on some herbicides, when you buy the herbicide, you automatically get the jug of the adjuvant at the same time. That's good because it reduces all the confusion, but it stifles creativity. Somebody might have an idea that could develop an adjuvant to make it even work more than the one that's sold with the product. But if you can't market a good product, then it dies, and then it dies.
Water hardness can affect whether or not a herbicide is taken up by a plant. How do we determine if our water is hard, I guess?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is have your water tested so that you know exactly which minerals are in the water and at what concentrations. I think there's information from chemical companies or distributors or dealers that can help you identify if this is, it's called soft water, hard water, very hard water, or extremely hard water. They can kind of help you with the different brackets or categories. but it doesn't take a lot of minerals and water to deactivate herbicides. So if you just assume that your water source may be a problem, and then you take corrective action against it, that would be actually a very good plan of attack to make your herbicides work better.
I do love that we've already got a comment that very hard water is ice, which, maybe. Okay, so Tom, you had one observation. What has changed since that video came out all those years ago with Deb?
It's 4 years ago. I think Rich is correct in everything he says, to be quite honest with you. I don't think anything's really changed. Canada has a regulated market for adjuvants, and the registrant has to provide proof of efficacy. Now, we've divided adjuvants into two broad categories: the activators, so-called, which improve efficacy of a product so that maybe you can reduce the rate of that product, and utility modifiers, which sort of change the behavior of the product in the tank. And those are the ones that are now acidifiers, maybe to provide some solubility of some products that only dissolve better in acids, or drift reducing agents like interlock that Winfield United, for example, manufactures. Those are the kinds of things that the data isn't that expensive to generate. It's just basically, does it lower the pH? Is that true? Does it
Right.
change droplet size? So you can do that. But having a regulatory or having a research program that goes into all the ecozones and provides 5 set years of data like we do for herbicides or other pesticides, that basically says that these small companies, and many of them are quite small, will never come into Canada. It's too expensive.
Mm-hmm. So, Greg, Rich uses the term that it stifles creativity. Do you agree with that?
So I do, because we have many things that we have in the United States that we haven't been able to bring to Canada. And first, I'd like to do a shout out to all the great Winfield United Canada people up there that are helping us spread the story. I'm just so proud of them, and they're doing a great job bringing some of our technology to you guys. And if you have to register something, it costs a lot of money. And so when we were just simply dealing with Eastern Canada, we didn't have enough market to bring things to Canada. Thank goodness now we have a presence in Western Canada, and now we're actually bringing some products to Canada. And you have the process up there with the co-packs and stuff like that. We're actually thinking that it really, there's a lot of flexibility you don't have when you have co-packs. And then guys don't use both sides of the co-pack as much, so you've got inefficiencies from that. The people in Winfield United Canada are unpacking things so that you can come and buy this adjuvant system, use it with a series of herbicides, and have better efficiencies. You can mix and match better, and we're excited to bring that up there. But yeah, there's quite a barrier to entry if you're bringing an activator adjuvant. And one of the things we have a lot, because we have freedom in the United States to do this, we have combination products. So you'll have an activator adjuvant mixed with a utility modifier. And in Canada, we've got to go register that product. In the United States, we can just run and gun with it, and we do. Now, having said that, we do an awful lot of research here in the United States because farmers are our owners, and we're trying every day to make farmers' lives better. And every once in a while, we actually are able to do that. So I'll just leave it at
That's a
that.
win. That's a win. Okay, so but I'm also hearing, as you said, Tom and Greg as well, that there's sort of two types. We do in Canada have many of these things sort of built in, or they come with the product or whatever. But it does. We are getting into this space where it's like, well, maybe that isn't quite enough. Maybe there is more that we can do, but that then, of course, is another layer of education, right? So Tom, how do we sort of help growers and agronomists to help their growers navigate this space?
Yeah, it's not easy without the research data. I don't think that we should, it's I never recommend a product to someone whose performance I'm unsure of, because why would I transfer that risk onto my customer? But let's also remember though that open door, that missing, that gap in efficacy that might be left on the table without competition. I think the chemical companies are actually quite acutely aware of that gap, and they don't actually want to leave that door open either. So they don't want to have a product that works so, and then all of a sudden an adjuvant will be allow someone to have the rate, let's say. That's a very obvious thing to try to avoid. So even with a regulatory hurdle, they don't want to leave themselves susceptible to that eventuality.
Hmm. Now, I want to talk about water. I think, and we should probably spend a bit of time on water and hard water, of course. And as you mentioned, Tom, and I mean, do should farmers be testing every year between different water sources if they have more than one? If we did actually here at Real Agriculture, we did a poll this past spring, especially because it was dry and because there were some restrictions on water use, and we did a poll to see where people got their water from, and a lot of spray water is actually on municipal systems. So, are is it dangerous to assume your water is not hard? It's going to be fine? It's not going to cause an issue?
I would say I'll let Greg go right away, but I would say, for a municipal source, you're probably relatively certain it's not going to have a lot of things in it, because, of course, they try to take care of that and do their own testing. I think you'd be crazy not to test your water, though. It's not a very expensive test. You find out things. It's just like sort of calibrating your nozzles. You think everything looks good, and then you calibrate them and check their flow, and you find something that is a little odd. You may find something odd in your water too, and you just know. It's easy to correct in most cases. Greg.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So I would agree. And we've done, oh, I don't know how many thousands, lots of thousands of samples in the United States of water quality. And then, like in 2018, we started testing up in Canada. And in Ontario, Peter Sikkema is sitting on some great water. And so he doesn't really need to do a lot. His water is really good quality. But as we tested in these Western Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, we found some really bad water up there. I mean, it's yeah, there's some bad water up there. Now, having said that, your ideas are good. Usually, the water in a city or a town is pretty good. Usually, if there's a rural water system, that water is pretty good. And then the wells are all over the place. So you've got
Mm-hmm.
very good wells, you've got wells that are just awful. And
Mm-hmm.
there I would definitely test. I would test your water source no matter what, because then you know where you are. But having said that, the bad water sources are typically wells. Some people are taking surface water. Surface
Mm-hmm.
water is a mixed bag. Some of that is actually quite good, and some of that
Mm-hmm.
is pretty nasty too. And I'll just leave it at that. Go test. It doesn't cost much. Once you've tested, usually the water is fairly consistent, so you don't have to test like every year or anything like that. But and then I would qualify that on the surface water. I maybe would, because you've got things
Mm-hmm.
going on with weather and stuff like that. But in the other things, the wells and the city water systems, no, you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to test very often there.
So we did, though, in that poll, we did ask, and municipal water was quite common, but so was using a well, a private well. And yes, some people will, some farmers are using either, a slough, or they're using, some sort of natural body of water that they're drawing water from. So, I mean, it really was sort of all over the map.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely. I mean, it's hard to know, especially in wells. Um, it's really hard to know what you have unless you test. And so Peter Johnson reminds us, don't guess, test.
Yeah,
That's
There
right.
you
And
go.
there's a
I like that. And
Yeah.
to give you an idea, um, so in some of these wells in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, it really wasn't that hard to find a well that was 2,000 parts per million in water hardness, calcium, magnesium, things like that. And that's like, oh, that's nasty water. Please go find another water source if you can. And then another thing that was kind of surprising up in Canada was how many of the water sources were actually not hard, but they were just full of sodium. They were just
Mhm. Yep.
salty. And actually sodium can antagonize a lot of these herbicides as well. So
Okay.
yeah, go test.
So
No.
that's a really important point, Greg, because the hardness is measured using just calcium and magnesium, and there's a formula applied that makes it into a calcium carbonate equivalent, and that is total hardness. That's what all the water tests do. But as Greg said, sodium, iron, potassium possibly contribute to hardness as well. And is it potassium or phosphorus? I actually may have gotten that one wrong. But the sodium component is not counted when total hardness is calculated. And for example, in the
Mhm.
Moose Jaw area, Chaplin West, there we know it's very high sodium waters there. I was going to say, Les Henry, a retired soil scientist, wrote one of the best fact sheets on water quality and sprayers,
Mhm.
probably 25 years ago. And the best thing about that one is he knows the province of Saskatchewan so well, and he identifies all the problematic aquifers because he knows exactly where they are
Mhm.
and what how they typically test. And you're right; it's the subsurface waters, the wells that are usually they've had time to absorb minerals. Surface waters typically have other problems. I mean, they have maybe turbidity problems, that kind of a thing.
Right.
But I
Which they're
really
trying to correct
recommend,
all that too.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Don't tell Les he's retired. Okay, so I guess I'm quite okay. Now we do have a question. So Kent Erickson is asking. Now I'm going to assume RO is reverse osmosis. I missed a little off the chart, but interested to know if there's any downsides to using RO water for spraying. Any antagonism, and so this antagonism part is one of the ones that we need to sort of identify where these things happen. So are there any downsides to using? Oh, we lost Greg. I'm sure he'll be back. We'll just keep rolling.
Yeah. The downside to RO water is really the cost of producing it. It's a very expensive process, very energy intensive, very slow, in fact. And I don't know whether it's actually cost effective. We do have treatments for hard water. Another question in the chat on the side was, how hard does it have to be
Yes.
hard? And I guess there's
Yeah.
two different scales. The hardness testing equipment that we often get comes from, the little kits, comes from spa shops, right? And you can get your hardness test and other things. But hard water in the spa world is actually quite soft water in the sprayer world. We don't get alarmed at hardness until we hit about 300, 350 parts per million of calcium carbonate equivalent or total hardness. 350 is
Okay.
the benchmark for glyphosate, for example, that Monsanto back in the day published. And they said, look, if you're doing the half-liter rate per acre equivalent of Roundup Original, and you have 350 parts per million of hardness, you should condition your water with ammonium sulfate. And that was the general recommendation. And then they said if you use double the rate, then of course the double hardness is tolerable. Well, 300 to 700 parts per million of total hardness is incredibly hard if you own a hot tub, and it's manageable if you're a sprayer operator. So it
Okay.
is possible to just simply treat the problem that you have, unless of course it's in the thousands. I saw a
Right.
sample from someone who came into my door actually this winter, and he no one's ever found me in my office before. I don't have office hours, but he came
Yeah.
in and he brought me a jar of water, and he said, "Can I spray with this?" And I said, "Probably you can, but it might
Yes.
not work. I have no idea from looking at it."
Yay.
And
Great.
and then
Yeah.
I said,
Just
"Go
do
test
a
it."
visual
He went,
test. Yeah.
yeah, he went next door to the Saskatchewan Research Council, which has their lab right next door to my office. And they came back. He sent me the results, and it was so high in sodium that the hardness, according to the formula that John Aliwaya provides, was about 10,000. It
Oh
was
my
the hardest
gosh.
water I'd ever seen. So
Yeah.
I said, "Don't whatever you do,
So I
don't
feel
spray it,
so I
don't
feel
drink
like
it, don't do any of those."
perhaps that farmer had already anticipated that the water might be a problem. I'm just going to assume at this point that that's
If he had
why.
If he had taken a
Yeah.
sip of it, he would have spat it out. Yes.
Yeah, he probably would have known. Okay. So Gord asks in the comments, of course, how hard is too hard? And the wells test 200 to 300. So that is borderline,
That
right?
is
Like it's
okay. I mean, it's
fine.
entry
Yeah,
level
it's
to
okay.
possibly
Yeah.
treating it. There are two different ways of really looking at it. You can use the sort of the hard cutoff of 300 parts per million. Below that, don't worry about it. But you can also use this incremental formula that Winfield uses, and it was developed at North Dakota State, which says how many parts per million of each of these cations do you actually have, and then we'll prescribe
Right.
a rate of ammonium sulfate for you. And so then, of course, even small amounts of hardness would trigger some small amount of rate. And the question is, really, is that necessary? Back in the day when I talked to John Nalawaya, and I used to travel with him sometimes on speaking engagements, and he would say, Tom, in general, just add a kilo or a 1%, I should say, a kilo per 100 liters, 1% solution of ammonium sulfate to your spray water. It takes care of most things, but if it's extra hard, then add some more. That was his general recommendation. I think very practical.
So now I hope that Greg will rejoin us because I do really want to talk about some of these specific products and what we can do. pH is another one though that certainly gets talked about. Now Peter says there are some herbicides you don't want ammonium sulfate with, isn't there? So what's the caveat for ammonium sulfate? Or is that an
I
Ontario
I
thing?
actually don't know of one, to be quite honest.
So Peter,
I'm not
Peter, if you have
aware.
one, do
Yeah,
share.
please,
It's
I'd like to
probably
hear that
yeah.
one.
We're going to have an airing of grievances. I know Festivus is long past, but here's one of my things that I didn't really know about until I moved to Ontario. And that's that Ontario and Western Canada actually have completely different herbicide products, or they have the same herbicide product with a different name. And that is my grievance. I do not appreciate that there are so many different ones, and sometimes the same one has a different name.
Well, you just have to call them by their active ingredient name,
Right.
like
I tried that,
glufosinate.
Tom. Yeah, but some of them are not easy to say. Okay?
That's
So
true. That's
I'm
kind
just
of
putting it out there.
that's
That's
how
why
we
we
have
have
fun with
trade
you.
names. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Jason suggests dicamba. Um, okay, because of drift. Okay, Jason, no jumping the queue. We are going to talk about
That
drift.
that is
Yeah.
100% correct, and thank you for reminding me of that.
Okay, so it's a
Because ammonium
drift
sulfate
issue.
is actually
Okay.
an acidifier, it actually
Okay.
liberates the vapor component of dicamba. And yes, it's
Okay.
the dicamba
That's why.
still works, but it adds
Yeah.
to
It
the
will move.
volatility problem.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But I really hope Greg comes back because I want to talk about interlock and these sorts of things. Now, two people have brought up water temperature. So while we're waiting for Greg to reconnect, Tom, does it really matter if you have very cold water or very warm water? Does water temperature actually play a role in
It does
spray
matter.
efficacy? Okay.
Yes, it does matter. It's a great question
Why?
because it's funny. When I studied at Ohio State, we would take maybe we had a slew of maybe 10 adjuvants that we often went to. They were just a range of different activators, and we sprayed them and atomized them and tested their droplet size at a
Hey, Greg,
variety of
maybe
water
try
temperatures. And we
restarting
found
it.
that the droplet size change that they caused was dependent on water temperature. So that one was an eye opener, and it's possible that you might create or a drift prone situation by using the wrong kind of temperature water. The other thing that's actually very interesting is there are some formulations that are that are sensitive to bicarbonates and hardness, and if those formulations are mixed in cold water, those hardness issues become more severe, and they create a bit of a gumming up of the oil surfactant
Mm,
in that formulation. So I think, like in anything, like doing the dishes, warm water dissolves things better, mixes better. Everything's a little better with at least room temperature or ambient water, and not the 5 or 10 degree water that we might pump out from a well. That's why, a lot of people that I deal with, they have a well and they fill a holding tank in their yard, and they just allow
yeah.
that tank to warm the water up for a few days or weeks before they end up using it for spray water. And the question that I always have is, what color should my tank be? And it really ought to
Right.
be, first of all, not clear and as dark
Right.
as possible for that reason. Yeah.
Okay. So now we're going to get into painted black. But should it be black and or Yeah. So just as dark as possible. Should I paint it? Should I
The
spray paint
the
it?
idea is, yeah, painted black. We can play that song later. And there was these
No,
guys that did it in
we can't afford
Wisconsin.
that.
They
Yeah.
recorded it for us. Actually, they actually did
Yes,
a
there you
beautiful
go.
version of it. Jason wrote that song, and
Yes.
great
Yeah.
job. No, the idea is to keep light out, because even water with pesticide residue in it, believe it or not, will grow algae. And if you have a white tank, a clear tank, white, whatever, that allows some water rays to come in, algae will grow in there. It'll mess you up. And that's why.
Okay. So I will have you know that after doing one of these episodes with you and Jason and talking about the black tank, we did for our watering system for our sheep out on pasture, we did actually spray one of the tanks black and it worked. So there you go.
Excellent. Glad to hear it.
So thank you for that. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Greg is working. He's got a few technical issues happening in the background, but he is going to come back. So, Jay, if you can, let's go to the clip. And Tom, you're going to recognize this gentleman. And I hope we left in the very beginning with the aviators, but just everybody watch for that. But let's introduce. I do want to talk about drift. I want to talk about what we can do about it beyond what we add in the tank, but of course what we add in the tank. So Jay, if we can, let's go to this school with Tom Wolf.
People see sprayers and they worry about drift, and agriculture is cast in that light. So it's really our responsibility, not just for downwind targets, but also really for the image of agriculture as a whole, to minimize drift whenever possible. So it's a really important issue. I mean, it means it's a loss of product on the ground, but it's also a pollutant once it's off target.
Now, obviously, you have done a lot of work when it comes to drift and written lots of different things. What are still some of your main points when it comes to drift?
Yeah, drift remains actually quite confusing because there's a lot of sort of counteracting forces. Like, for example, we always think about wind and drift. And of course, wind's really important, because the windier it is, the more small droplets will leave the spray cloud that the sprayer produces and move off target. That's a loss. But on the other hand, what happens to it once it leaves? In that sense, wind can be your friend, because wind actually actively creates turbulence in the atmosphere, and it dilutes the spray cloud that you've lost. So its impact downstream is actually not as bad as you might think. It goes up and not so much across.
Now, does it depend on product to product how much wind you actually can handle, or is there kind of a rule of thumb across the board on wind speeds?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think that it does vary from product to product, and it's only because of two things. One is different products atomize differently. So you might spray a herbicide, fungicide, insecticide that has a certain formulation that actually creates finer droplets. And for example, the big example in our world is Liberty. Liberty atomizes very finely because it does have a lot of detergents in it. And so it makes fine droplets, and those are harder to control than some other formulation that doesn't do that, even at the same wind speeds. So that's one thing. The other one is really, what is the active ingredient and what's downwind? Because, a droplet of any given size will drift the same distance regardless of what product's in it. But the question is, how much harm can that drop cause? And so now that depends whether you've got a group 2 and you've got canola downwind, or you've got, a group 1 and you've got flax downwind. Different bad things happen, and I think everybody has to assess those separately.
Another important point when we're looking at drift is inversion. And I know inversion is one of those things that a lot of people kind of cringe at, because it can be confusing, it can be complicated, and sometimes there's not always hard and fast rules. Do you want to elaborate on inversion for us and the impact it has on drift?
Yeah, when we say don't spray when it's too windy, the obvious thing is to wait for when there's no wind. And of course, we do that. When does that happen? It happens later in the evening, maybe earlier in the morning, maybe overnight. So that becomes then the go-to time period for spraying. And we all know that growing up, we sprayed early in the morning to avoid the wind, and we stopped spraying when it got windy. Now, inversions are things that happen when it's actually calm. And that's too bad, because we also have to shut that door. The reason inversions are dangerous is because inversions are characterized by a stable atmosphere. In other words, that turbulence I talked about doesn't happen. So the spray drift that does leave the spray cloud, and there's always some, just by forward travel speed alone, even if there's no wind, there's going to be a plume that hangs behind. What happens to that plume? In an inversion, that plume stays put, and it moves slowly off target with some small wind, or maybe with slopes. And when it gets to its destination, it might be quarter mile or even a half mile or more away, it's still concentrated. It hasn't dispersed and separated. So it can cause a lot of damage there. It just kind of lingers. And so what we see is square miles might be affected by an inversion incident, and they might be damaged equally. Whereas if it was windy, you'd probably only see the border area of that section damaged. So, you have to balance those things.
So my fingers are crossed. We're hopeful to get Greg back. He was hotspotting from his phone, apparently. So Fargo is great for a lot of things, like the movie, but not so great for Wi-Fi, apparently. So we're going to keep trying because Greg's got some really great thoughts on products specifically and some of the great research they do at Winfield United, and some of his takes on why we need to treat our spray water and the solution. So, but while we're waiting and hoping that Greg, he was there for a moment. Okay, we'll keep trying. Let's talk a little bit at least about drift. So I think inversions, of course, are one of those things that, we need to be aware of first and foremost. Nozzles come into play, water volume comes into play, but what about products? What else can we do with our spray tank to potentially minimize drift?
Yeah, Greg and I spoke earlier today about this very thing, and I said, Greg, I come from the old school of hardware first, right, where you do the adjustment of the machine first, so the boom height, the travel speed, the nozzle choice, the spray pressure, all the things that control droplet size and its fate essentially from during spraying. But there still are some problems that you can't solve. For example, in that clip I mentioned Liberty. It's a classic product that atomizes fairly fine. And a lot of people might have a low drift nozzle on their sprayer and they look over their shoulder and they, against the evening sun, they see that spray plume and they say, I'm not happy with this. What can they do? And of course, that is exactly the place where adjuvants have a role to play. You can quickly change the behavior of the spray by adding a low drift adjuvant like Interlock, for example, in there. I mentioned Interlock not just because Greg's here. It's a big product. It's a product that works well. There are other products like it as well on the market that basically are an oil-based adjuvant, and what they can do is eliminate the small droplets without increasing the large droplets so much. And that's what nozzles do poorly. If you want to reduce small droplets with a nozzle, you're going to add large droplets. That's what they do. They shift the droplet size spectrum, and these adjuvants are a little bit more surgical than that. So the downside of the loss of the small droplets isn't as severe in terms of coverage.
Mm-hmm. So Joey has a question here. With higher chemical costs, are there any concerns that chemicals will be diluted too much? Is that I'm not sure if that's, yeah. So do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, it's a concern, and let's say that you've got 1,000 acres to spray with a particular product, but you only have product for 3/4 of that. What are you going to do? Are you going to leave 250 acres unsprayed, or are you going to stretch that product? With the traditional advice has been to not use lower than label rates, primarily to avoid in the long term, the emergence of things like polygenic resistance. Sort of, the most hardy weeds survive, and then they set seed and they produce progeny that is even hardier, and then we have the beginning of a runaway problem. But I think one of the things that I think adjuvants can do here is they can give you more bang for the buck. So if you do good agronomy, and that is early seeding, you've got a competitive crop, that kind of a thing, and then early removal when the weeds are small, and perhaps the weather hasn't hardened up yet, it hasn't gotten hot and dry just yet. Early removal will possibly allow you to stretch that herbicide. So I'm not a big fan of doing that, but I think when your back's against the wall, you certainly would think about it, and that's, I think, where judicious use of water conditioners and the surfactants that we talked about is highly appropriate. In the adjuvant world, there are so many pitfalls, unfortunately, because every mix is unique. Every tank mix, every other thing interacts, and the people who make these formulations cannot anticipate everything. So we're now going from, we're talking about multiple effective modes of action tank mixes. So for example, if you've got kochia in your land, you have to assume it's group 2 and group 9 resistant. And the multiple effective mode of action idea says you should now put 2 additional modes of action in a tank, both of which are effective against kochia. So you probably will still do a group 2 and a group 9 because they work on a lot of other things, are very useful. That means a 4-product tank mix. So, what exactly is that going to behave like? I
Yeah.
think you ought to be careful about that.
So, and along that line, Peter brings up, of course, there are other things we may have in that tank, potentially fertilizer. So, does adding other things to the tank, such as fertilizer additives, change the droplet spectrum as well? Relating that there was some real injury with low rates of fertilizer additives last year. So what
That's right. And
happens? What happens there?
yeah, this is a huge matrix of unknowns because there's a lot of specialty fertilizers out there from a lot of small companies. It's legal to sell them and add them to your tank. The PMRA has certainly given the green light, or the CFIA has given the green light on that. There needs to be no regulatory process there, but they are typically maybe they don't play well with each other because they're salts usually, and that means they can disassociate and reassociate with something else that may be necessary, in the tank.
Right.
So the biggest disasters I've seen in terms of tank mix things gone wrong involve specialty fertilizers. And
Mhm.
so there you could have a clean out issue. You could have a persistent problem for hundreds of acres after you've sprayed that tank. Things just don't come off the walls. I would really say the jar test is one thing you can do, but I would say for 2022, when you can't go back to the retail to buy some more because it's already expensive and they probably won't have more, I would avoid
Yeah.
some of those things.
Right. There you go. So that is, I am hopeful that there is some moisture that returns to the west. That's one of the things. But the other is that I'm hopeful some of the supply chain issues work themselves out by the fall. But I think we all have to be very honest that that's probably the most optimistic we can be, which means, and we've had this conversation with many different farmers, listeners, some people have things in storage already, other people have it lined up that, to your point, you may not necessarily be able to just go out and get more of X, either because it's no longer economical or because it's simply not there. So once you got a plan, you sort of have to maybe put some extra planning before you head out into the field, and maybe don't try and put as many things in the tank as possible to save a pass.
That's right. Let's err on the side of caution for 2022 for sure. And remember, it always boils back down to good agronomy, doesn't it? Even in the spray business, I always try to bring things back to agronomy. And agronomy timing is key. So as I already mentioned, early removal. And efficiencies are important. Let's do everything we can do agronomically that makes it easier for the pesticide we have to apply to do its job. Let's plant varieties, cultivars, crops that are inherently more resistant, perhaps, to pests and weeds, maybe more competitive, that can be seeded early and take available of early season moisture. Um, you know, because the best test, it's maybe a thought experiment, maybe it'll become a reality for how well your crop does without a herbicide or an insecticide or a fungicide is to not have that available and have no choice but to do that.
Then
And
so
you will
choose
probably
wisely.
wish, yes,
Yeah,
it's an expensive experiment, but it's possible that that's what's going to happen. So I would just
yeah.
say let's use good agronomy.
Right. Okay. So quickly, one question. So we did talk about holding tanks, certainly for water, so to warm it up or just so it's more available. What possible problems might there be if I'm going to use, let's say, chlorine to control algae in that tank? So if I add chlorine, am I potentially adding an issue when I go to use it as spray water?
The results from our informal surveys are that it's not a problem. A lot of people talk about using chlorine pucks in tanks to keep the water from forming algae, and they say there are no negative consequences for their product performance. I don't know of any scientific studies that have done that. The classic caution is always that when we use an ammonia style cleaner, we should not also use a chlorine based cleaner
Right.
because it forms a chlorine gas. Now, the pucks are a much lower concentration of chlorine, so they're more of a passive presence, and I don't know whether the addition of that will cause that release of chlorine gas. But I think we would still be wise to err again on that one on the side of caution, just to be sure,
Yep.
or at least you know not breathe in deeply while your head's in the tank.
Right. Well, and perhaps, you know what? We've all gotten used to masks. Just use one that's appropriate. Okay. So, cloth one, not appropriate. You'd need an actual respirator. All right. Okay. So, I'm not suggesting you are to the grocery store. That's it. I would like to welcome John to the comments. He's usually the first one and welcomes everyone, but he's late. And so apparently the storm knocked the stuffing out of him because he's been sleeping. So there you go. Oh, Greg's here. Greg, can you hear us? I feel like we're at a seance. Greg, can you hear us? And can we hear you? Because if you can, then I want to go to you while we have you. We're trying. I don't know. Maybe not. You know, Greg, if this doesn't work, and to everybody else out there, I'm going to reconnect with Greg. We're going to do our own standalone interview on some of the things I wanted to talk with him tonight, and we'll post it on realagriculture.com because we had such a great chat before this even started, and I'm really excited to share some of the things he wanted to share. But if we can't, I'll do it on my own, and I will share it with everybody. Another question about adding things in. Okay, so let's talk about pH. Can you add vinegar to lower pH in hard water?
The question is, why would you want to lower the pH of hard
Yeah.
water? That's the question. And
Yeah, it's
the answer is
confusing,
that
to be
there are
honest.
some acids that, when they're added into water, they dissociate, obviously, and their ions that they leave behind can form conjugate bases with some of the hard water cations. Okay, so that's
I'm just
chemistry.
gonna write this down. Hang on. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
vinegar's not one of those. Okay.
Okay,
So
got it. Yeah,
it's not generally. I was hoping Greg would answer that. I was hoping to pose that question to him as well, because there is a strong market for acids as adjuvants
right.
in Canada, and the traditional use is to, if not to soften water, which would be a very special kind of acid, then to make glyphosate work a little better, because glyphosate tends to become more oily as the pH goes lower and lower and lower, and so
Okay,
that is one such market. But I'm
okay,
not a huge fan of modifying the pH of spray water, and the main reason is that the upside for glyphosate is relatively small. The best thing to add to a glyphosate tank is ammonium sulfate. It makes it work way better. You don't have to lower the acid to caustic levels. The second reason is that there are many herbicides that are often in a tank mix that do not dissolve well in low pH water. And those herbicides may come out of solution and may create tank cleanout issues and create problems down the road. The classic examples of
right,
those are very common tank mix partners. They're group 2 herbicides, the sulfonylureas, the triazolapyrimidines, and a few others.
mhm,
These are basically the products I'm talking about, are basically the FMC products, the Bayer products, and the Dow products. Okay, those
okay,
three manufacturers make group 2s that dissolve better in high pH, and the remaining one is BASF. It markets the imidazolinones. The IMIs dissolve better in low pH water. And so
okay.
there's that differentiation where I guess you could judiciously use an acidic modifier if you wanted to, but I'd be very wary of changing the pH. Herbicides want to be in a pH of roughly between 7 and 6 or 5, and not much beyond that. Most herbicides lower their pH naturally. They're mostly weak acids. If you glug some glyphosate into a pH of 7.8, it'll go down to 5.2. That's what glyphosate is, an
Hmm.
acid. And so you actually then are potentially harming the solubility of a group 2 tank mix partner that needs a more basic environment in which to work. So I kind of personally have always said, let's stay away from pH modification. It can lead to problems.
Right. So then my brain, of course, goes to also, and you mentioned it, clean out issues as well, right? In that realistically, if you're causing anything to sort of to either salt out or join up or gel or any sort of these changes that we don't want, you're then not only impacting that spray pass, but then does it hang around in the tank? Is it hanging around in the end caps? Is it like you create another whole level of issues potentially?
It's expensive. It's wasteful. The biggest currency during the spray season is, of course, timeliness. What are you doing right now when the weather's beautiful and you should be spraying? Are you scrubbing out your tank because you have a problem?
Mhm.
So those are the kinds of things. How much is that hour worth? If that hour that you didn't spray that quarter section in results in that quarter section getting rained on and not getting sprayed for another 5 days, that was indeed an expensive hour.
Yeah, a very costly one. So
Yeah.
Gord's question about the humic or fulvic acids, that is what you were talking about of changing the pH potentially so making glyphosate more effective.
I don't know about the specific acids that he's mentioning, to be honest. So
But it's the pH question. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
I
a
don't.
pH question. The idea here is that glyphosate has 4 dissociable groups, and they're all ionic, and therefore that's why glyphosate is so incredibly water soluble. The lower your pH is, the fewer of them are ionized, which means they just hydrogen goes to them, and that makes them oily. Okay. The
Okay.
problem is that last
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
That one doesn't become ionized, or that doesn't get a hydrogen until pH about 2.
Oh.
And
Okay.
so even if you lower the pH to
Yeah.
2.5,
Yeah.
glyphosate is still going to be very water soluble, right? So it's kind of a futile search for, making a herbicide oily. It gets a little oilier, but still plenty water soluble.
Yeah. So one of the things that, and John's got a good question, and we'll maybe get to it in just a minute, but we are running short on time. But one of the things that you did talk about, and that I know Greg wanted to talk about as well, is part of this issue is the lifespan essentially of the droplet, right? So in really dry conditions, or in these things, what can we do to make sure those droplets get where we want them to go, but then are actually in a form that the plant can then take up? And this brings us back to that first video. So are there things we can do to make sure that the integrity of that droplet is maintained and gets to that plant?
Yeah, and what did Greg say at the beginning of the broadcast before we went on air? He said
He,
something about
he
rocks.
Yes, and we're going to do this, and he says plants can't drink rocks.
That's right. That's
And
what he said.
that's
And
that is
what he,
what he said.
yeah, what he meant was that when a herbicide dries onto the leaf, usually the result is a crystal of undissolved, the water, the carrier, the solvent is usually gone. And it's not true for all herbicides, but certainly the water soluble ones. Thermodynamically, those crystals can't make it through the cuticle. They need a water carrier to make it across. And so, how do we preserve the longevity of that deposit? The classic things there are, of course, larger drops, evaporate slower, give more time for uptake, that kind of a thing. Maybe weather conditions in which the humidity is, or the delta T, as we talked about once, is sufficient that it doesn't cause a lot of strong evaporation. But this is where I wish we were in America, because there are humectants, and you can buy humectants in the spray market in the US that will keep that drop wet longer. And
Yeah.
I don't know of any that we can buy here. So that would be very useful on a hot day, for example, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are certain disadvantages to living in a tightly regulated environment.
Yes. So and that maybe does sort of bring us back to that leaping off point of, we certainly have advantages to having, the expectation that these products work and the research has been done, and those sorts of things, and we get our products sort of prepackaged ready to roll. But exactly that, when products exist in our neighbor's backyard and we can't access them. Also, when you say humectant, all I can think of is like peat moss. I don't know why. Anyway, but that's all I think of is like something, and it's a word I hate, but something very moist. Yeah. So, okay, question though, and this is exactly what I sort of came to. In really dry conditions, plants can't drink rocks, they can't eat rocks. So, of course, if it crystallizes, if it re-wets with humidity overnight, do we get more absorption?
There's a great study there using a refined extra. Actually, it was published in Weed Science maybe 25 years ago. It was a great paper that I'll never forget, because I was asked a question on it during my exams down there on that very paper. Here's what they did: is they wanted to know what the effect of humidity is on the performance of trifensulfuron, was the herbicide, and they sprayed it on a different drop sizes, and they found that the very smallest drops didn't work at all. Did not work at all, and they evaporated dryness before they could do anything. But then they did put them into this humidified chamber overnight, and it resolubilized the dried on deposit of that one treatment and
Oh,
allowed it to work. So yes, it can happen. I don't know if it's a good strategy, because the issue really is, does it hit if it's a small droplet, does it have it actually hit the leaf, or does it go around the leaf? Does it
right.
drift off? A lot of the times they evaporate in the air, and then they don't adhere to the plant that they're intended for. So you have to make sure that small droplet is in fact on the leaf before you
Yeah.
rehydrate in some way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Or the head, whatever the target the plant part that you're targeting. But
That's right.
either way, it has to actually be there for humidity to ever work. John has a question. I just want to quickly, because we were talking about potentially bringing the pH really low in the spray tank, does that have an effect? And this is kind of along the lines of when it's really, really dry, people think they should drive over their fields with a spray tank and like irrigate it. But does a really low, so a highly acidic spray, does it have any impact on soil pH?
Ray, where are you when I need you? Ray's listening in,
Ray's
but he's
here.
not to
Ray
type
is
his answer.
absolutely here. He's probably like, yeah, I
I would
gotta go
say
get a
I'm
drink.
not a soil
Tom, I'm out of
scientist
here.
and I shouldn't answer the question,
There you
but my
go. That's
understanding
okay.
is, and I stand
Yes.
corrected if I'm wrong, is that soil is quite highly buffered and can probably tolerate the small amount of material that we put on it that has a different pH. I mean, we are talking about, um, 10 milliliters per square meter. It's not that's a 10-gallon per acre application. It's not a lot of material, but hopefully I'm right about that. I certainly wouldn't want to harm the soil, bio.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So Ray, who's ignoring you, anytime you want to hop in here, maybe we'll have him on next time and I'll ask him. Yes. Anyway, Ray says you got this. You're fine. So you're on your own, Mr. Agrimetrix. Now you're a soil scientist. Anyway,
Ask me
but
another
you know
soil
what?
question.
Yeah, exactly. You can make
Ask me
things
about
up. So
phosphorus.
yeah, exactly. Here. No, but I also think that I mean, it's great to think about, right? I mean, I think it's an important exercise to think about what are all the things I could potentially impact by doing this, right? So, I appreciate that kind of question. And so Jason, of course, has mentioned the discussion on interlock, and as you mentioned, there are other products as well, but interlock is definitely one that seems to be quite popular. Lots of questions about it. So, mm, and so, what does interlock do? And I mean, this is the part where Lyndsey just smiles and goes, "Mhm, mhm," because
Yeah,
I don't really know.
and that's
So
why I was so happy to hear that Winfield United agreed to come on this podcast
I
with us
know.
today,
Yeah.
because they actually have the most impressive testing facility that I have. I mean, I'm not just saying this because they're guests here, but I have seen. I visited Winfield as a scientist just to see what they have. They have a wind tunnel that is, without question, the best in the world. They have the ability to measure active ingredients and how they atomize in the wind. They do that with tank mixes, complex tank mixes, and they are
Mhm,
working for farmers, as you said. So they actually have the data on the performance of their products. This is what I like about the company. And so when they say interlock reduces drift, they say that because they've sprayed the pesticides that are normally sprayed in the Great Plains where the product is marketed, and they've documented the fact that the addition of interlock reduces the driftable fines by about 50% without very significantly adding to larger droplets. That's
right.
its key advantage. That's how it works. It changes the way the product atomizes. Seems to be, as I said, active ingredient or formulation specific. All adjuvants depend on that factor to some degree, right?
Mhm,
It's a mix, and it also depends on the kind of nozzle you use. So, for example, interlock was intended as an adjuvant to reduce the drift of dicamba in the early days. But through a certain nozzle, interlock actually went the opposite way. It actually made the spray finer when
mhm,
atomized through that nozzle. Fortunately, Winfield had the data, and that's how I met Greg. He presented the information at a scientific conference that I attended, and said we then actually changed the formulation of that product and made sure that it did not increase drift risk
mhm,
with those nozzles. And that's the kind of questions that I think a customer ought to be able to ask of a company. Show me the proof that this works.
mhm.
And especially in an unregulated environment like in the United States, where you simply don't know because the company may not have data, I would always ask for the data. Uh,
Mhm.
Prove it to me. Because an experiment on your own farm, Rich alluded to it, having a 28-day waiting period before you know whether it worked or not, well, that's an expensive proposition, right? I would much
Yeah.
rather have the company assume that risk for me and provide me with credible data that perhaps is peer reviewed. And
Mhm,
I mean, that's the gold standard, but I think we should request it.
mhm. Well, and we talk on this show and through Real Agriculture. I mean, we often talk about trials and on-farm trials and trying something on a small scale, these sorts of things. But ultimately, as a farmer, you maybe have 40 seasons, 50 seasons. Um, that's just it. Waiting the 28 days and trying it out in 1 year, that's actually a long time, or as a percentage is a lot of the years you have to try things. So get the site year data done from somebody else.
That's right. And Winfield isn't the only company that does adjuvants in Canada,
Yep.
right? There's Loveland, there's others, and they're all reputable companies. They're large enough to have large research facilities, and they do provide the data. They do test, so it is not a marketing free for all by any stretch. But I do think that that is the key question. We often see claims, right? And we often see testimonials and in all manner of agricultural inputs. It's such a common marketing tool. And I think we need to just say, okay, stop it, everyone. An anecdote is not a research trial.
Mm-hmm. Also, though, you have introduced several things into our vocabulary and another layer of things we have to think about and learn. And so we'll keep trying, Tom. And I really do
Okay.
appreciate that, you just make my job harder. No, it's easier. I swear. I'm super sad that we did lose Greg. He was so keen to be on here. Fantastic to join us, and glad he made the time, even though he was on the road. So my promise to everyone watching, I am going to reconnect with him, and I have a couple questions I really want to hear his answers on as well. Tom, thank you for being gracious and filling in for Greg. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined us tonight in the comments. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you've got an idea, an idea for an evening or a guest you'd like to see, send me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com. John says, wouldn't it be awesome if we could speed up all these trials to the speed of poultry genetics? 8 or 10 generations in 1 year. Imagine. Tom, can you work on that? Can you just
No.
no. There are limits to the magic that Tom Wolf can do.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right, Tom, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And hey, now there were some comments. Do you want to do a shout out? Are you speaking? I think Lara and Ray have both said that you've got an upcoming talk at the Agronomy Society of America talk that's coming up.
So the
That you
Agronomy
want to
Society of
comment?
America, that's January 20th,
Yep.
and we'll be talking
Okay.
about, I'll be partnering with Dan Martin. We'll talk about his work with drones and aerial application of pesticides. He's the leading expert in that. And I'll talk about ground application of fungicides primarily into canopies. And there's another one that's actually quite interesting. This one is sponsored by the Canadian Society of Agronomy. It's on March 25th, and it's a webinar, and it's going to be on adjuvants.
Okay, cool. All right, so there you go. If anybody needs a link, let us know. All right, Tom, thank you so much. It was wonderful to see you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lyndsey. Great to talk to you tonight.
All right, and thank you to everyone for joining us. As always, remember you can head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist for your CEU credits. Thank you to Adama Canada for being our show sponsor, and to Real Ag Radio. Wonderful to see you all again. Join us next Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern, for our next episode of The Agronomists. Cheers, everybody. Bye.